Okay, we are in Esther 9. We're picking up in verse 18, and this does continue through the remainder of the chapter now. And I have titled this one, The First Thanksgiving, because why not, right? But it has to do with, when you go and lay this out, I think you're actually going to see some parallels of the text. And so we want to look at kind of where we are in the larger part of this passage is now having defeated the antagonist Haman and then having gained great victory over all those who were following him and were continuing to carry out the original decree, and that through the second decree gained from Xerxes through the actions of Mordecai and Esther, then they have a great victory. And we're going to note it took one day in the larger portions of places where there weren't as many people and the problem was not as concentrated. And then it took 2 days by Esther's request to be able to fulfill this decree. And that was done, though, and so they were able to celebrate great victory, and everyone in that process, remember the time frame, you had a great upswell of support for the Jews and recognition of what had been done for them, and of course, as Mordecai had been raised to prominence. So I look at this now, which is very important, because we've now had the full climax of the original problem. That's been settled. Now, but something still happens after that is built upon what happened in the climax, and that's falling action. That's kind of where we are. And we've been noticing that all along, so this story as a whole, we're going to go over this probably next week to see the big picture. But that now there is a story about what happens after that. And once you have a great success, what do you do? And so they end up essentially as just a natural, organic response to what's happened is they celebrate. And that original celebration then is then moved forward into the future on a yearly basis, which is why it becomes a holiday, as a reminder. And it's really important when you look at the book of Esther, because here is where the explanation of why are we celebrating these days. Remember, this is written as a book years later, probably at least 50 years later. So it's serving one of its purposes, there's more than one, but one of its purposes is to inform Jews of future generations, to remind them of something significant of why they even still exist. And every year they were to remember that in this. That's what this is all about. So I've divided it up. Verses 18, 19 is where it's going to explain the circumstances where we are. And then what leads to all of this, and then the establishment, the climax of the holiday, then as how they respond to it, and then how they feel about it, which is essential structure that we've been looking at throughout. So we have throughout this section, and this has been true before, that you have Esther, but I want you to notice now what role she is emphasized for her in this text as we go through it. Because in this text, she is operating as the ruler. Now, she's not king, but that is a role as queen that for the Jews, she is actually exercising throughout this. Mordecai is still, I think, the explorer. That is, you're going into new territory is the idea here. We're doing new things. And then you have the Jews, how they're affected, and that's just generally what we call the everyman. Everyone, how do you feel about this? Everyone's the same boat kind of thing. All right, so that's what's going on. So let's look at this beginning in verses 18 and 19 is the exposition. But the Jews who were at Shushan assembled together on the 13th day as well as on the 14th. And on the 15th of the month they rested and made it a day of feasting and gladness. Therefore the Jews of the villages who dwelt in the unwalled towns celebrated the 14th day of the month of Adar with gladness and feasting as a holiday, and for sending presents to one another. So this is the setup for what follows, but it is also in some ways it's recounting and reviewing what happened after the battle. So when it says that those who assembled together, that was they assembled to fight. Okay, they were the ones who got together in Shushan. That's why it's specified. Those in Shushan assembled together on 2 different days, the 13th day and the 14th day of Adar. They rested on the 15th day, and they made that day a day of feasting and gladness. But throughout the rest of the empire, remember, they completed the task on the 13th day, which was the original day that was selected. And so they had the celebration on the 14th day. Notice, it's like they're just doing this. But they did it on the 14th day, again, with gladness and feasting. So we had feasting and gladness, gladness and feasting. You see how they've turned that up again? This is a really nice writing. But it is as a holiday and for sending presents to one another. So he's just telling you kind of what they did. And they didn't, this isn't like remember, they did not take spoils. So when they're sending presents to one another, it's not like they're going and through stuff and they've got all this new stuff. They're just exchanging gifts because of how happy they are. And they're wanting to find different ways to express that to one another. And it's also a uniting thing. I want you to think about this, what he's done here, both by talking about Shushan and then all the unwalled, the unprotected. So you got the palace city, a big walled city, then all these other places that don't have all of that, but they're all united in terms of how they feel and how they respond to this great opportunity and this great victory and what it means for them. And so it's designed to kind of give you an overview of what they were doing spontaneously because of this. He's going to then shift then, this is operating a little bit as a transition from the original situation to how do you get from that original situation to doing it yearly. So that's why at the end when he says as a holiday. It had never been done before. It was just spontaneous. But it's going to lead to something more. So you have a situation where the Jews in Shushan celebrated the 15th, which matched the rest after their victory. Okay, that goes back to here in verse 18. But we also see that the rest of the Jews celebrated the 14th, and they added sending presents to get that in, because the date coincided with victory. It came up from just their natural joy from all of this. So now we move on, and so what do we do as a result of that action? Okay? That's verses 20 through 25. And Mordecai wrote these things and sent letters to all the Jews near and far who were in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, to establish among them that they should celebrate yearly, that's the key, the 14th and 15th days of the month of Adar as the days on which the Jews had rest from their enemies. There's your purpose. As the month which was turned from sorrow to joy for them. So you have an understanding of what is significant. And from mourning to a holiday. So you've got the emotional touch. That they should make them days of feasting and joy, of sending presents to one another and gifts to the poor. Now, mostly what he did in these verses is he codified what they already had done and made it a yearly thing. He combined the different days that each had celebrated and said, we're going to do this on both days. So it's going to be put together 2 days, and the same joy and the feasting we're going to repeat. And what is the value of repeating something. Again, it sprang up spontaneously, but now being codified, and you're going to do it by assignment, essentially. Refresh your memory. It is important in taking those opportunities to refresh your memory about something important happened. And we need to remember it. That's exactly right. And notice how he builds on this. Last thing is interesting because sending presents to one another, but then he adds this, and to the poor. And I'd say the thing here is, it's one thing to exchange gifts, right? Y'all ever have those exchanges where a lot of times people at work or sometimes in families they'll say, okay, everybody we're going to all do it, or it could be just, you pick your number and then you put a dollar amount. Here's what you're going to do. And then depending upon which one you are the person who sticks as close to that dollar amount as possible. And some of you people ignore the dollar amount entirely and make the rest of us look really bad. Okay. I don't know why I thought I needed to bring that up, but I did. But you have this, the reason why is, the problem is what if you can't afford a gift for somebody? Why does he add, and to the poor? What's the point? He doesn't want any Jew left out of the joy. He doesn't want any Jew left out of the joy. The poor, he wants them to get something too, so that they are part of this, and they are part of the feasting, and they are part of the gladness, even if they don't have other things. Be quiet, because this is something that is a collective joy, because it is collective deliverance. It affects all of us Jews. So what do? They matter in this. Their survival is part of all this too. We're all in this together. And if we're going to do something that's in recognition of something God did for us, we'll get to that probably next week, that has that great significance, then everybody needs to be a part of it, even if they can't afford it. Okay? And there are times we will do that kind of thing and make it available, and people will give to make sure no one's left out. That's the spirit of what he is doing here because of that significance. Verses 23 through 25. So the Jews accepted the custom which they had begun, as Mordecai had written to them, because Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of all the Jews, had plotted against the Jews to annihilate them, and had cast pur, that is the lot, to consume them and destroy them. But when Esther came before the king, he commanded by letter that this wicked plot, which Haman had devised against the Jews, should return on his own head. Notice that word return, because that's what we've seen in the whole of the story. It is the irony of everything turning over. And that he and his son should be hanged on the gallows. That is, what did we just cover there? What was that? It was a review of what happened. That's right. But that's important to make sure everyone understands. This is why we're doing it, and this is what we need to remember, going back to what John pointed out. We're not, okay, let's see how we do. We have a number of holidays in this country. But I think about the way some people approach these. Memorial Day. What do you do on Memorial Day? Cookout. That's right. What do you do on July 4th? Cookout. What do you do on Labor Day? Cookout. I'm not sure these really have the significance we think they do, because they're somewhat detached from their meaning. That's what he did not want to have happen. He wanted to make sure that the process of what was done was always attached to meaning. Okay? So when we think about what he is, you attach the why. Why matters. And as he is coming off of this, when you come off the story, and it's what you have with Esther is this is written in such a way that this whole thing can be read and told in its entirety at an assembly on those days. So that they can come down, and at the end you have this account. Here's why you're here. Don't lose track as you're preparing that meal of why we're here and why we're doing this, why we're taking off and we're not working, and this is a holiday. This is why. It's not just for the joy of, oh, I don't have to work today. There's some other meaning behind it. He didn't want them to lose that. And because it's going back to their very survival as a people. And he wanted them to remember that. So what happens? It becomes official, and that is moving forward. So it's now an official Jewish holiday. The people, the next part that happens is they accept it. Now, that's interesting because Mordecai declares it, but the people still have to accept it. The practice has to be, that's good. And then they used it to remember Esther and how sadness turned to joy. Now, you'll see this hint. We'll come back to it in a moment. But isn't it interesting that it is highlighted about the poor, the lot? That's what's significant. I want you to stop and think about why. But then we get to verse 26. So they called these days Purim after the name Pur. That's the climax. So because this story is just about the establishment of the holiday. So here we go. We've got a holiday. Does it strike you as a little bit strange that you'd name your holiday after the casting of lots that was originally done for your destruction? That's right. They didn't call it Queen Esther Day. They didn't say beat the bad guys day or, victory over Haman Day. They didn't call it any of that. They called it Purim. Why? Because it got down to the real purpose of it. You're exactly right. Purim, but when you have the I-M ending, that's just plural. So we say lots. We hear that it'd be either lots or casting of lots. That's what it's called. Now they didn't sit around and cast lots. That was not part of what they were doing, was it? But it was named to remind you of where all this started. Remember, it was not just about the joy. It wasn't about gladness and feasting. It was sorrow to gladness. It's named after what started the first part of that. Why? Because the design of this holiday, as Mordecai has done it, is to try to make sure that everyone goes from the point of this is where this began, and he wants them going through the full gamut of emotions from the point of the sorrow to the point of the joy. I'm going to pause here for just a second. What do you think about during the Lord's Supper? Because the Lord's Supper is designed to take us all the way back to the beginning of what it cost God for us to be here singing songs to Him, praising Him, and being able to look forward in hope. And that's really where it takes us if you look at 1 Corinthians 11. Because it walks us through the necessity of Jesus having to come to have a body, to the fact that He had to die, And that it's only through that blood shed that we get a new covenant, which makes it possible for us to now look forward to have this relationship with God that has hope. So we get to do it, we have it to do every week. They were doing it every year. We do it every week. A lot of times you'll run into people and say, why do you do it so often? That's, first of all, because of Acts 20, verse 7. Well, it would just lose its kind of feeling, people say. Doing it every week is designed to reflect the significance and how much we need to be remembering all the time in a solemn way. Right? It's not the same as a feast because it's not about the food, but it's the starting point. So I think that when you look at why they call these things Purim, where they start, now they end, and throughout the whole of worship, so should we, right? If we end up, if we tell the gospel story and we leave Jesus in the grave, we've missed something, haven't we? Pretty significant. Okay? But that's where the core thing begins for us of what he did. So they named it Purim. So what from this then? Well, that picks up again in verse 26. Therefore, because of all the words of this letter, what they had seen concerning this matter, and what had happened to them, right? The Jews is established and imposed it upon themselves and their descendants, and all who would join them. That without fail, they should celebrate these 2 days every year according to the written instructions and according to the prescribed time, that these days should be remembered and kept throughout every generation, every family, every province, and every city, that these days of Purim should not fail to be observed among the Jews, and that the memory of them should not perish among their descendants. If we go through and take a look at this, notice the parallelism and the repetition of what the purpose was and what they wanted from this. Okay? The inclusion of anybody that wanted to celebrate, doesn't that match up well with the people who became their supporters? It's acknowledging that not everyone was against them. But you get the multiple times descendants. And you have, from this, we establish it. And so what do you have to do? Why does this statement have to follow? It's been established. Because the fact that you get a decree establishing something, that's not enough. It depends on the response to the decree of whether or not the people are going to implement it. They took it seriously and made it their practice. So it's one of those things where you can have a lot of things that kind of, here's what we do, and you go, here's what we do in theory, and here's what we do in practice. Okay? They need to match. And that's what he's saying, is that they had this decree, but they ran with it. The people responded by saying, absolutely, this is what we're going to do, and they put these things into practice, and everything's pointed out, kept throughout every generation, every family, every province, and every city. The entirety of it, JT.
Is this still celebrated today?
Yeah, you'll find it on calendars. Now, to the degree that how they do it, usually it's pretty, it's pretty comparable in ways. I mean, usually, the Jews have been pretty adaptable after a while of how they approach things, but especially among the Orthodox. But I have some friends that are from high school that are connected, and I still see that come up in their posts on Facebook. So now verses 29 through 31. Then Queen Esther, the daughter of Abihail, with Mordecai the Jew, wrote with full authority. You notice this shift? It's now Queen Esther. She wrote with full authority to confirm this second letter about Purim. And Mordecai sent letters to all the Jews to the 127 provinces of the kingdom of Ahasuerus. That was his role and his position, with words of peace and truth. Now, when you think about this, is what's the fall in action over the climax of a big fight. Words of peace and truth. To confirm these days of Purim at their appointed time. Notice that the shift is, we're not celebrating this by reminding everyone that everyone's our enemy. It's that God has delivered us from our enemy. That's the point, the truth and peace part. So to confirm these days of Purim, okay, at their appointed time, so get those days out, it becomes now codified. This is pulling it back to where it started in this section about going to put it into writing. As Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther had prescribed for them, and as they had decreed for themselves and their descendants concerning matters of their fasting and lamenting. Now, what was the fasting and lamenting? Where was that coming from? Where did it happen in the story? That's right. So that at the end of chapter 4, that Esther, remember, she says, here's what we're going to do. You tell everybody you know to do this too. And so here's the connection with that. So again, what do you have even here? It's going back through the account so that it's not just about the end, it's about the process of how did we get here? What did we have to go through to be at this point? So you get the holiday codified. You've got it being official because of Queen Esther. Now, her entrance into this is important because of this is the first time you've seen her in that kind of official capacity acting like this. And then Mordecai sent the letters confirming it. So now we've got this moved through in an official kind of governmental kind of capacity, because that's how both of them are acting. But now think about this. Do the Jews have an independent government at this time? No. That's why it's actually interesting that it's sent throughout the 127 provinces. Well, what are those provinces? They're certainly not Jewish provinces. We go back to the beginning of the book. Those are the provinces of Persia, right? All those people who are affected. But that's where they were sent out. Now, remember that Israel proper, the designated area, Judea, was part of the Persian Empire. They were part of this too. Verse 32. Here we have, I think, the denouement, which makes it interesting when you get to chapter 10. How are we to feel about this? So the decree of Esther confirmed these matters of Purim, and it was written in the book. This is designed to close everything off and say, okay, it was again, though, the decree of Esther. She's been raised up and recognizing this promise and authority, confirm these matters of Purim. So all these things are now, confirmed is actually a more important word, because it's talking about everything's been tied off. Everything's official. It's been put down in writing. It's been distributed. Everything that we need to do to make this an ongoing holiday has been done. And that's why, and it was written in the book. All of this is about it was made official. Okay. So you've got an official record, Esther's decree, and we say, on the record. This is not stuff that's going on and wouldn't this be nice, or let's talk this over. It was done and put out and made public. Okay, that's the key. All right, so that brings us to chapter 10. Chapter 10 is only 3 verses long. And I'm going to go ahead and put this out as a story, but it's really not a story. Okay? But I'll give it to you in that way and look at what it's actually accomplishing. So you have here 2 mentioned only. That is, you're getting perspective about Xerxes and about Mordecai after all of this has come to a conclusion. Now, if you were going to look at it, that's why I say this is kind of twisted here a little bit. This is pushing the envelope. You'd see verse 1 as an exposition. Verse 2 is the rising action of how things are going. And then verse 3 kind of boom, 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 finishes everything off. Okay? And that's kind of, for the Jews, it's Mordecai, and this brings up an interesting question. So that's what we're going to look at. So verse 1, and King Ahasuerus imposed tribute on the land and on the islands of the sea. Now, I want you to stop and think about, what does that have to do with this story? Yay, Jews, we were successful. And the king goes, taxes. And you're thinking, normal. Right? It is, but the fact of the Xerxes is, number one, as an overall story, it tells you an understanding the broader picture that we're covering everything off from the end and going back to the beginning. What are some of the things that were issues at the very beginning that were covered before this came up? Meaning the original exposition of the story, and we may be able to talk about this next week. The original exposition was before there was a problem. Those first couple of chapters. What do you have during that time period? You have him setting out for war, coming back with his tail between his legs, and they were having some issues. This is actually partially solving that problem. So you're having a correction governmentally to what he was doing. Okay? On the land and on the islands of the sea, so the whole empire basically. So we've got a new policy in place. Now, what have you learned about Xerxes as a political official, as policy? He seems a little bit busy for these kind of details, doesn't it? Okay, yeah. No, to me, that's the way I read the text as well. But he's the one in charge. So then we look at verse 2. Now all the acts of his power and his might, and the account of the greatness of Mordecai, to which the king advanced him, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia? That's not an unusual statement to make. It's kind of saying there's a lot more that could be said, but that's been written down elsewhere and is not pertinent to this story. That's essentially what he's doing. But it's, number one, it's acknowledging power and might, which is where you begin. If we go back and read in the very first chapter, it's describing Xerxes, Ahasuerus, as this is the Ahasuerus that was ruling over the 127 provinces and all big. That's the reputation by which, when this was originally written, he would have had. All right? So this is, in a sense, then at the end, partially getting him everything back on track. Mordecai is brought up. What could possibly be the reason for Mordecai to be brought up here in this context then? Might he be the reason why? Because you're talking about the greatness of Mordecai, to which the king advanced him. He was second in charge. So he's the one that's kind of doing all the more difficult kind of things behind the scenes that are more policy oriented. And then it says there, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia? Now, We do not have, to my knowledge, the full record here. However, just a couple of weeks ago, I found out that someone had written a book on this, that they have got more of this information from the Persian point of view, and I haven't gotten that information yet. I am so sorry, because I'd love to see what more maybe I can find out based upon some additional Persian records, because so much of it is coming from the Greek side. Okay, but I want to see if there's a difference in portrayal of what we learn about him, and if there are some details that maybe we're missing. Because we have such a hard time, as people have asked me, setting this into Persian history specifically. It's just, we know the dates, we know the time period, but the details and the people, because they, as we know, the same name, we don't even have Xerxes' name here. It's Ahasuerus, because you're working it through multiple languages. So there are a lot of things, and as you know from Daniel, that often use different names. So it's just hard to tell. So that's the unfortunate part. So the key aspect here is that Mordecai is building a reputation. Okay, that's really key. So at the end, we just look and say, here's why. Mordecai the Jew was second to King Ahasuerus. From the point of view of the book, that starts with he's an advisor to Esther, and then all the things that happen, and you end up with he's second in command. That's quite a rise. Okay, so that is significant. So you have him elevated in office, but coming down from this then, that's where he was governmentally, officially. The next part, what comes from that, and was great among the Jews and well received by the multitude of his brethren. Now, I find this to be, this is poignant to me, especially the last part. Great among the Jews, prominent and well received. I want you to go back and think about chapter 3. He was prominent in chapter 3 because he wouldn't bow down to Haman. And he was not well received. So now, just the way people see him has completely flipped. So this is kind of tying off that reversal of fortune idea with Mordecai. So he grows in popularity, and now we have the end, seeking the good of his people and speaking peace to all his countrymen. He's elevated. Here's what he's doing. The nature of policy, that's okay, official. He has official policy and a role in official policy. His motives were seeking good for the people, and that's probably the Jews, but I think you can say everyone. But he sought peace. I want you to look at and contrast this attitude of being in that role with his predecessor. Haman was seeking what was good for Haman. And he didn't care about anybody else, and he certainly didn't care about the Jews. And he didn't worry about being at peace. Conflict was something he seemed to enjoy. And yet here with Mordecai, the difference of how that government's going to operate, because this is the attitude in which Mordecai is operating. It's totally different. It's going to shift policy through shifting just even the processes of how this goes about. All right. I am not overviewing this in the next 3 minutes. So we know better than that. But we're going to do that next week. We're going to go over the entire book of Esther and to see it from big picture. So now we have walked through, and I hope that you have a different kind of appreciation for this book. We're going to talk about purposes, its organization, then we're also going to talk about purposes of this book and really try to now land on the spiritual point coming up. because you have to see it as a whole, really. We can throw some small things in, and I've given some hints along the way, but we ultimately need to see it as a whole to appreciate why this book exists. But I hope the other thing is, I was wanting to show you, and yes, this is one of the things I teach in the school, is how using an analysis of narrative, a basic analysis of narrative, helps you focus and see things that you otherwise would never see. And because of that, it lets you to understand the structure that was originally there. And by doing that, certain things are going to come out. You're going to be able to make connections better that you wouldn't have done before. And I hope that next week when we go over the whole, that will be even clearer again. So appreciate it. It's been a nice journey through this book. But we're gonna come back to it again. We're not done yet, and we've still got some things to learn. So I'm going to let you off early and get a jump on all those kids.